of the ways that we can be pure in heart, as we just sang, is by controlling our thoughts, by controlling the way we think, and then, of course, the way we act on those thoughts. This morning, I'd like to share with you some thoughts regarding fear, regarding the kind of fear that we have and how we respond to it. We're going to look at three different types of fear, so to speak, and the reactions to them. We're going to look at a fear that led to fighting, a fear that led to being fraudulent, a fear that led to fraud, and third, a fear that led to faith. And all of these examples are going to come from the book of Joshua. And we're going to look at the fear itself, the reaction to that fear, the result of the fear, and then the relevance to us today. Our first example comes from Joshua chapter 10. If you'd like to turn there. Joshua chapter 10, we'll look at the Canaanite Kings. Our first example is the Canaanite Kings in Joshua chapter 10. What kind of fear did the Canaanite kings have in Joshua chapter 10? In verses 1 and 2, we read, "Now it happened that when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted it to destruction, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, they feared exceedingly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty." So the kind of fear that we see the Canaanites have is they have a fear of Joshua and a fear of the city of Gibeon. And this fear is because of their might, because of their power, and because of what they've done. And they hear that the Gibeonites, which were already a great city, already a powerful people, the Hivites, they've teamed up with Joshua. They've teamed up with these new people, with the Israelites, who are going around destroying everything in their path. They already defeated Jericho and they defeated Ai, and now they've teamed up with the Hivites. And so the other Canaanites, the Amorites, their fear is a fear of man. Their fear is a fear of man. Notice that there's no mention of their God. There's no mention of Yahweh. There's no mention of the true power behind Joshua and behind his armies. Their fear is solely of man. Hebrews 13, verse 8 reminds us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is unchanging. Man may change, but God is unchanging. And you may overcome man, but you will never be able to overcome God. Now, what is their reaction? Their fear is a fear of Joshua and a fear of man. And our reaction when we look at man and we say, I think I can overcome that. And that's the reaction that they had. Read in verses 3 and 4. "Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Deber, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me, and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel." So their reaction is, I'm going to take these other men, and so we have these five kings, and the five kings of the Amorites, the five kings of the Canaanites, they are trusting in themselves. They're trusting in one another, and they're going to overthrow Gibeon. They're going to overthrow these men. So if our fear, if the only thing that we have a fear of is man, then our instinctive reaction is going to be to try to overcome man. But look in verse 7. Look in verse 7. What was the result? "So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you." So we see that the Lord has entered the picture. Verse 9, "So Joshua came upon them suddenly." He had gone out marching all night from Gilgal. "And the Lord threw them into a confusion before Israel, And he struck them with a great slaughter at Gibeon and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. Their fear was a fear of Joshua. Their fear was a fear of Gibeon. They didn't fear the Lord. And as a result, when they tried to rebel, when they tried to fight against God, they didn't realize what they were doing, and God was the one who defeated them. Because they did not have a fear of God, they did not anticipate his power, and they thought that they could overcome God. This reminds me of a war that happened in Australia. Now, Australia, I've heard Australia referred to before as British Texas. And there's a lot of parallels there that you can imagine. They're basically, it's a bunch of cowboys, and they're all rugged, and they're tough, and they're not really scared of anybody. And that's how we as Texans are, right? We're proud to be Texans, and we're not really scared of anyone. We'll just fight them off. Someone comes to attack, we'll just fight them off. Well, that's what the Australians said too, except their enemy was birds. They had a war. You can look this up. This is legitimate. They had a war with flightless birds. It's called the Great Emu War. They lost. They lost. In the Great Emu War, you had the Australian army trying to get rid of all these emus across the desert, and so they sent out the Australian army to go kill them off, and they lost, which I find amusing. But the point being here, they thought that they could overcome their enemy because their strength was in themselves, and they looked at their enemy and they said, "Oh, surely we can overcome them." Now, the point here is not that God was on the side of the emus, unless perhaps he was. But the point here is that when we trust in ourselves and when we look at our enemy and we say, I can overcome that by myself, I can overcome that through my own strength, our perspective is completely wrong. For the Canaanite kings, their perspective was, I can trust in myself and I have no fear of God, but I only have a fear of man. So when we apply that, and we look at the relevance, a fear of man without a fear of God leads us to trust in ourselves, to fight against God, to reject his warnings, and that leads to death. In Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 41, Jesus told the parable of the landowner, or the parable of the tenants, or the parable of the vine dressers. It's referred to by all those names. And in this parable, Jesus compared the history of the Israelite nation to a landowner. And the landowner has this vineyard, and he leases it out to some workers, the tenants, and he sends some servants to go collect the produce. And he sends the servants, and the tenants receive the servants, and they say, "Who cares? We'll kill them." And they kill them. And so the landowner sends some more servants. Now, of course, these servants represent the prophets that God had sent throughout the hundreds of years of the Israelite history. And they kill those servants as well. And then the landowner says, "I will send my son, because surely they will reverence my son. Surely they will respect. Surely they will have a fear for my son." But when they found him, they said, "This is the heir. We will kill him and take the inheritance." So they kill him, and that, of course, represents the crucifixion of Jesus. They killed Christ because their fear was not a fear of God. They trusted in themselves. They thought, we'll just ignore these servants because we don't fear the landowner. We don't fear his servants. We don't fear the one who sent them. And that's what this means for us today. When you hear the message of God spoken by the men of God, you have to listen. Not because the men are men of God, but because their authority comes from God. When the Scripture is read, when the Scripture is taught, if we don't heed that, if we ignore that, if we reject that because of a lack of fear of God, then we will ultimately be destroyed. Jesus concludes the parable by saying, "Now what will the master do to those worthless servants?" And even the Pharisees understood. He will cast them out into the lake of destruction. Of course, we don't want that for ourselves. We don't want that for one another. Our second example is a fear that led to fraud. This is in the previous chapter, Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites. Our second example is the Gibeonites. Now, chapter 10 began with the Canaanite kings being appalled at the treaty made between the Gibeonites and the Israelites. So where did that come from? What's that talking about? Chapter 9, we have a description of that. So let's look at the fear that they had. Joshua chapter 9, verses 9 and 10, they, being the Gibeonites, they said to him, "Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of Yahweh your God. For we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who is at Ashtaroth." Their fear was because of God. They understood that the power of God was related to this. The power of God was behind this. In verse 24, after the events of the chapter occur, they answered Joshua and said, "Because it was certainly told to your servants that Yahweh your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore, we feared greatly. We feared greatly for our lives because of you and have done this thing." So their fear is because they understand the power of God. They understand who he is. They understand that he made a promise to Moses, that he made a promise to the Israelites, and that he has the power to keep, to fulfill that promise. So their fear is in the right place. The Canaanites, their fear was only of man. They didn't have a fear of God. They didn't have any comprehension of who God was or his power. But the Gibeonites understood that. They looked and they said, that's not just Joshua. Joshua doesn't have that power by himself. He has that power because of his God. Now, I want you to notice something. This is really subtle. But they don't make any statement about God being almighty. They notice that God has power, but there's no rejection of the gods that they already have. They recognize God as being powerful. But in their thought, in that culture, they would simply add him to their pantheon. They had all the gods that they already believed in. They had the Baals that would be assigned to each city. They had their own regional gods. And then they had the Ashtaroth, which were basically the consorts of the Baals. And so they hear about Yahweh, and they just add him in. He's just another one of the many gods. Very similar to the remarks that Paul references in Acts chapter 17. The Greeks just added him into their gods. So they don't recognize the almighty nature of God. So their fear is in the right place. But how do they react? What do they do? What do they do as a result of this? Look in verse 4. Chapter 9, verse 4. "So they acted craftily and went and traveled as envoys and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended and worn out and patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes on themselves." Their thought was, we'll just pretend that we've come from a far country. We'll pretend we've come from a far country. Verse 6, "They went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, 'We've come from a far country, so now cut a covenant with us.'" They lied. They were being deceptive. They were being fraudulent. But they said to Joshua, verse 7, "Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, 'Perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we cut a covenant with you?'" They were told not to make covenants with the people of the land. So they're trying to check against that. But then in verse 8, they said to Joshua, "We are your servants." Then Joshua said to them, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" And we saw their response a moment ago. Their reaction, their response to this fear that they had was to be deceptive. Now, what does that mean? What does that tell us about what was going on in their minds? Well, by its very nature, deceit works off of the idea of you're still trusting in yourself. You're still trusting that I can deceive the one whom I'm talking to. They were actually trusting in Joshua's mercy. You see, they were trusting that Joshua would be willing to spare them if they're able to deceive him just right. And they can get around the punishment. They know they're supposed to be killed. That's what they're trying to prevent. So they try to use deceit. Their trust is actually in Joshua. They don't trust in God. They trust in Joshua. Their fear led them to fraud. They didn't trust that God would be willing to spare them if they submitted, but they did trust in Joshua. And as a result, they were spared by Joshua. Look in verses 14 and 15. So the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask for the command of the Lord. And there's other lessons to be learned there about going to God and seeing what you ought to do and checking the commandments. But right now we're focusing on the Gibeonites. Verse 15, and Joshua made peace with them and cut a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. They were spared by Joshua, but they were not accepted by God. Look in verse 27. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose. So Joshua brings them in, he accepts them, but notice that they're not integrated into the people. They're not permitted to worship with the Israelites. They are turned into servants. God did not accept them into the blessings that he had. A fear of God that only leads you to fraud, that leads you to hide from God, leads to punishment. It means you don't receive the blessings. You may be accepted by God's people, but that doesn't mean that God accepts you. In Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, we read about the parable of the talents. In the parable of the talents, we have a very similar situation. God entrusts three men, by parable, entrusts three men with various amounts of money. And the first man gets 5 talents, and the second man gets 3 talents, and the third man only gets 1 talent. And of course, the first man goes, he invests it in the bank, he gets 5 more talents. Second man, he invests it, he gets 3 more talents. But the first man, what does he say? He says he's fearful. He's fearful of who God is. He understands God's power. He understands the might that God has, and so he chooses to bury his talent. And when God comes, he says, I knew you that you are a hard man, and I was afraid, and so I hid my talent. He tried to deceive God. Well, the problem is, you can't deceive God. You can't deceive God. Acts chapter 5, we read about Ananias and Sapphira. They lied to Peter, and they thought they could deceive Peter, but they couldn't deceive the Holy Spirit. And they were punished for that. So what does that mean? Are we going around lying to God? Well, probably not. I think we understand that as a general principle that we can't very successfully lie to God. He can read our thoughts. But God will judge us based on how wisely we use our opportunities. The Gibeonites could have used that as an opportunity to submit to God in faith, but rather they chose to hide. They tried to be deceitful. The man in the parable of the talents could have used his opportunity to invest the talent. He could have used his opportunity wisely, and he would have been blessed for that. But instead he was punished, and instead the Gibeonites were punished as well. And as a poignant contrast to that, we look in Joshua chapter 2, the example of Rahab. She's our third example. We look at Rahab. Rahab had a fear that led her to faith. A fear that led to faith. Joshua chapter 2. Look in verse 8. Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 8. Now before they lay down the spies that she's hiding, she came up on the roof and said to the men, I know. She has, first of all, a confidence. She has a confidence in what she's saying. I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and that terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of land have melted away before you. She knows who God is. She knows what His power is. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. So far, what she's saying sounds a lot like what the Gibeonites said. We've seen what you've done. We know it's the power of God. We know that He's giving you the land, and everywhere you go, no one can stand before you. But notice the difference. Look in verse 11. Indeed, we heard it, and our hearts melted, and a courageous spirit no longer rose up in any man because of you. For Yahweh your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. She makes a proclamation here of God's almighty nature. She recognizes that Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of the Israelites, He is God over the heaven and God over the earth. He is supreme. He's not just one of a pantheon. He is the God. And notice how that changes her reaction. Her fear was because of who God truly was, and her reaction reflected that. Look in verse 12. So now, please, swear to me by Yahweh, by the Lord, since I have shown loving kindness to you, that you will also show loving kindness to my father's household, and give me a pledge of truth, and preserve my father and my mother, and my brothers and my sisters alive, with all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. She trusts that she trusts that God will be willing to deliver her, because she has trusted. Her fear was in the right place, and she redirected it. She didn't have a fear that led her to cower like the Gibeonites. She had a fear that led her to be faithful. She could have been like the Gibeonites. She could have hidden. She could have sold out the spies to the leaders when they came by. She could have tried to subvert. She could have been like the Gibeonites and lied about who she was in order to gain an advantage. But if she had done any of that, she would not have been blessed in the way she was. What was the result? Well, in chapter 6, the Israelites actually go up against Jericho. And when they do that, they destroy the city. Look in verse 20. Joshua chapter 6, verse 20. So the people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down beneath itself, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. Now, if we ask a what if, well, what if she hadn't had this attitude of faith? What would have happened to her? Well, she would have been included in that. She would have been part of the city that got taken. Verse 21, they devoted to destruction everything in the city. That would have included her. Both man and woman, she was a woman. Young and old, ox, sheep, donkey, with the edge of the sword. But to the two men who spied out the land, Joshua said, go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out of there, as you have sworn to her. She was spared by Joshua. Verse 26, then Joshua made them swear an oath at that time. Cursed before Yahweh is the man who rises up and builds the city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation. With the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates. This city was leveled, never to be built again. She would have been included in that. She would have been destroyed along with the rest of the city, along with all her friends and the family members she had that didn't come into her house. She would have been a part of that. But notice verse 25. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua preserved alive, And she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. She wasn't just spared alive like the Gibeonites. She lived in Israel. She became a part of their country, of their nation, of their heritage. She became an ancestor of Jesus Christ. She was blessed because she took her fear her fear was in the right place, and she redirected it. She turned her fear into a faith. She didn't stay and cower. She didn't try to deceive. She didn't try to overcome Joshua. She didn't try to fight against God. She chose to be faithful. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 says that those who will enter the kingdom of heaven are those who do the will of the Father in heaven. Those who do the will of the Father in heaven. How does one do the will of the Father in heaven? Look in Matthew chapter 21. I want to read this parable. It's a short parable. Matthew 21. In Matthew chapter 21, starting in verse 28, Jesus said, "But what do you think? A man had 2 sons. And he came into the first and said, 'Son, go work today in the vineyard.' And he answered and said, 'I will not.' But afterward he regretted it and went. And the man said to the second, said the same thing. And he answered and said, 'I will, sir.' But he did not go. Now, which of the 2 did the will of the Father?" See, the will of the Father is the means by which we can enter the kingdom of heaven. And one of these men did the will of the Father. And by analogy, when we translate the parable into application, one of those 2 men is you or me. Which one are we? Which son did the will of the Father? Which son enters the kingdom of heaven? They said, "The first." And Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you that the tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes did believe him, and you, seeing this, did not regret afterward so as to believe him." Why did he do the will of the Father? And this is important because if we're going to be one of those 2 sons, and that decision to be one of the 2 sons determines whether we enter into everlasting torment or everlasting life, we need to know why the Son did the will of the Father. In Malachi chapter 1, verse 6, God is speaking to the children of Israel, and he remarks, "A son honors his father, and a servant his master. Then if I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is my respect?" And that last word, that respect, that's a fear. Where is my fear? If we don't have a fear for God, if we don't understand who he is, if we don't understand his authority, his power, then we'll never be willing to obey him. Luke chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, Jesus said, "I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have no more they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear the one who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." If our fear isn't of God, if our fear is of man, it's misplaced. If we don't understand who God is, what his power is, what his authority is, then we'll have no willingness to obey him. But we don't just need to have that fear, we need to use it. We need to use it rightly. A fear of God that leads to faith, a fear of God that leads to obeying him, that leads to salvation, that leads to reward. Do not be like the Canaanite kings whose fear led them to fight against God, that led them to rebel against God. Do not be like the Gibeonites, whose fear led them to fraud, that led them to hide from God, to act deceitfully. Be like Rahab. Place your fear in the right place. Have a fear for God. Then apply it and turn it into faith and obey God. I know this is a relatively short lesson, but I want us to really think about these things. It's a simple principle, but it has big results. If we don't understand who God is, we can't obey Him. If we don't understand that God is on our side, then we might believe a lie, like Joshua believed the Gibeonites. If you have been placing your fear not in God, but in man or in things of this world, then that's not faith. If your fear is of political changes, or your fear is of people who are different from you, or if your fear is, even if your fear is placed in false teachers, then your fear is in the wrong place. Because, as Paul said in Romans chapter 8, no one can take the love of God from you. The only one that we ought to fear is the Father. Our understanding of who He is should influence our every decision. That's hard to do. That is hard to do. And if you've been struggling with that, if you've been having a hard time putting your fear in the right place, you need to evaluate yourself. Think about that. And I say this in a serious way because I think a lot of times, we get to the end of the lesson, okay, so it's time for him to have an invitation, then we're going to sing a song, and we're all going to go eat lunch. But I want you to really think about this on a personal level. Really evaluate yourself. Is my fear in the right place? And if I do fear God over man, then what am I doing with that? Am I trying to live one way so that my Christian friends see me as being godly and upright, but at home I'm living a different life? What are you doing today? Are you living right? Does your fear of God lead you to obey Him? Does it lead you to have faith, to trust in Him, to trust in His mercy? A trust in God's mercy is what leads you past a fear of everyone in here to admit your faults. You should not have a fear of your Christian brothers and sisters, because we're not here to judge you. We're not here to tell you that you're wrong and that we've never been wrong. We're here to encourage you, to pray for you. Think about yourself. Think about any changes that you might need to make. And carry that with you, not only today, but carry that with you through the week, through the month, through the year, through your life. Evaluate everything you say, everything you do through the lens of Scripture. Is my fear in the right place? And am I reacting to that fear in the right way? If you need to become a Christian, or if you need prayers of encouragement, or you'd like to confess something that you've been struggling with, or a temptation you've been having, bring that time to